I've been asked, and it's my privilege to say a few words about what Fred meant to the New Haven Bioregional Group, and I suppose also what it meant to him. The short answer is a hell of a lot. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that in church, but the not so short answer is that whether Fred was presiding over a bioregional book group discussion, or performing in our Transition Roadshow, or starting a mapping project to define the boundaries of our bioregion, or explaining to the board of the UU all of the deep philosophical reasons that we needed permission to expand the bioregional lifeboat garden, Fred was always and will forever be the anchor, the spiritual center, the spokesman, the resident philosopher and intellectual guru of this little organization that has managed somehow to thrive without any budget, without any bylaws or formal legal status. Now, it's a difficult task for me to describe Fred's role in the group with any precision, not only because his fingerprints are everywhere, but because it's impossible to separate what Fred meant to the group from what he meant to me personally. I suppose if you could sum up all those things, if words were adequate to the task, you might sum them up by saying that Fred's wit, his wisdom, his insatiable curiosity, his generosity of spirit, his wonderful bellowing laugh that he seemed to reserve for certain self-deprecating jests by Roger Uline. All of those things were gifts. They were gifts of contagion. They were infectious in the best sense of the word. And Fred's very deep presence, his deep presence as a teacher and a practitioner of bioregional ideas is something that will be with all of us who knew him, certainly all of us in the bioregional group, until what? Until the day we take our last walk in the woods or our last gaze into the night sky. And you can see I'm already mixing up the personal and the bioregional here. But I was not involved with the bioregional group at its inception in 2005. My first encounter with the group was the same day I met Fred during a bioregional walkabout in East Rock Park when I had just moved back to New Haven after some time away in the fall of 2006. And during the course of that walk along the old winding carriage roads of East Rock, I had an equally winding conversation with this courtly, gray-haired gentleman that went from the weather to gardening to Woody Allen to Kierkegaard to Thomas Berry to Wendell Berry to Joe Lieberman and Ned Lamont, remember them, back to gardening, and at the end of all that, Fred invited me to serve on the Monday Night Bioregional Organizing Committee, and almost a decade later, I'm still on that committee. But what an extraordinary, epic conversation it was, and I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that some of you may have enjoyed or survived similarly eclectic conversations with our friend Fred. Fred was, as has been alluded to, a great writer, and many of us wish he had written and published more. But as a conversationalist, he was truly a man in his domain, to the point where, while the pace of bioregional group walks could be snail-like at times, if you were chatting with Fred, you had to be prepared for a grueling verbal and intellectual workout. And the addendum to that story is that I was so taken with Fred's nimbleness of mind after meeting him that day for the first time that I went home and I entered his name into LexisNexis on my computer, just assuming that he was a PhD academic, a professor of some ilk, and that he had an extensive paper trail of heavily footnoted monographs in obscure academic journals. And I was genuinely shocked to find nothing with his byline in Lexis or any other academic database. I would simply never have guessed that Fred had spent so much of his life doing things like framing houses, working with his hands, working in the garden. And it's tempting to conclude that Fred had acquired his great learning despite a life spent largely outside the confines of the academy. But I don't think Fred saw it in precisely those terms at all. I think for Fred, his carpentry, his vegetable gardening, his reading of William Blake and Gary Snyder were all of a piece, part of the same continuum of knowledge, part of the same human quest for meaning that at some point in his own life's journey had drawn him to bioregionalism. Of course, it wasn't just that Fred had read more books than 99% of his fellow humans, so that was certainly true. It was his penchant and his panache for taking an idea and making it come alive. That panache came out in his poetry. It came out in the services that he led for the UU. And it animated everything the bioregional group ever did, everything that made it so much more than just a hiking group or a social club. When Fred talked about saving seeds or growing food on your front lawn as a revolutionary act, you almost couldn't help but believe it the way he believed it, in the depths of his soul. And I don't know if it was because of or in spite of Fred's training as a preacher, and minister, and I'm sure he would have made a great one. Fred had a special way of launching the process of self-discovery in others. He certainly did that for me, and over again he did it for the collective intelligence of the bioregional group. For me, it was a process of self-discovery in which I realized that New Haven, the Quinnipiac bioregion, was the place that I belonged, though like Fred, I had grown up far, far away. For the group, it was usually Fred who, while anchoring us always in the vision and teachings of Peter Berg, whom he knew personally and whom he outlived, but sadly not by much. It was usually Fred who led us to the work of thinkers and doers like Rob Hopkins, Sharon Astick, and Dmitry Orlov, who deeply influenced and enriched our work, sometimes in ways that were not always visible to people who just came on our walks or our canoe trips. Fred's intellectual passions became extraordinary journeys for the group, and let me just describe a few of them. In 2007, Fred became interested in a little independent documentary film called What a Way to Go, Life at the End of Empire. We brought the filmmakers to New Haven and presented the film at USNH in Hamden to an audience of about 85 people, probably our biggest event up to that point. A deeply personal film that I think appealed to Fred because it mirrored his own journey to a bioregionalist worldview. The film penetrates very deeply into the spiritual darkness of what Wendell Berry has called our growth-obsessed civilization without limits. The film doesn't pander, it doesn't sugarcoat, it doesn't make Pollyannish promises about converting to compact fluorescence as the answer to ecological crisis. Its bracing and brutal honesty appealed to Fred's profound dislike of false optimism. And at the same time, it began a transformation of the bioregional group by deepening our understanding of the psychological dimensions of our society's addiction to cheap energy, the fetishization of economic growth, the opiate of business as usual. And it can't be overstated how much that transformation, which progressed in many forms over many years, has preserved the group's vitality. Were some people alienated by the attention we gave to this very challenging film? Undoubtedly, yes, but it's important to understand about Fred that he never put much stock in soft peddling the message that a civilization based on overconsumption and despoiling the earth was inherently at risk of collapse. Indeed, collapse was Fred's favorite subject matter. And he was almost always perfectly fine with separating the wheat from the chaff, as he occasionally called it. That is to say, finding whatever self-selecting audience was ready to hear the message. In time, the deepening of the group's thinking about an authentic bioregionalist response to our ecological predicament led us to the transition movement, with its gospel of relocalization and its promise that what followed the end of cheap oil could actually be so much more fulfilling than what preceded it. Fred and Bernard Brennan, who's here today, another member of our group at the time, led a study group in which we pored over Rob Hopkins' transition handbook chapter by chapter. And in 2009, we applied to become the 31st transition initiative in the United States. In our embrace of transition represented another phase in the evolution or maturation of the bioregional group. It led us into deeper discussions of peak oil and climate chaos, economic collapse. It led us to create the transition tent that we displayed for several years at the Westville Art Walk and the Connecticut Green Expo. It led us to create a transition roadshow for which Fred contributed a memorable poem called Petroleum Mon Amour that features Western civilization and fossil fuels as lovers cooing to each other in the night. It's surely one of the funniest poems ever written about the collapse of civilization. Only the mind of Fred Cervin could ever have produced it. It was around that time that Fred wrote an article that was published in the New Haven Register calling for 1,000 new gardens in New Haven, a mass mobilization for food sovereignty. More than anything else, it was growing food that Fred considered the fundamental act of bioregional practice. And in the article, Fred explained why we had started a lifeboat garden at the UU Church across the street. And he called on communities of faith in New Haven to embrace the notion of food sovereignty as food spirituality, to plant gardens at their churches, synagogues, and mosques, as the first Unitarian Universalist Society had done with the help of the bioregional group. Fred's call to action led to a series of meetings where members of different faiths came together to strategize about growing food with their congregations. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and even a Muslim woman from the Turkish community in West Haven participated in those remarkable sessions. In the end, Fred's passion on this issue got out ahead of his organizing ability, and the 1,000 Garden Project lost momentum. But as Fred understood it, that was the price one sometimes paid for preaching ideas that are a little uncomfortable, a little ahead of their time. Like James Howard Kunstler and many of the other writers he admired, Fred accepted that pushing against the grain meant sometimes missing the mark, and if it were ever easy, Fred told me once, that probably meant you weren't trying nearly hard enough to épater la bourgeoisie. I won't, but I could go on and on about how in the years that followed, Fred continued to catalyze for the bioregional group the kinds of adaptation and maturation that any organization needs to survive. I could go on about the jolts of energy he gave us when we were sputtering despite his own uncertain health. I could go on about the important projects he pursued even in the last year as his condition deteriorated. One of his final projects was to find a way to bring the mordantly funny Russian-American writer Dmitry Orlov to New Haven. Orlov being someone who shared Fred's perspective and his sense of humor about collapse. And another of Fred's final projects was to bring the bioregional group into formal alliance with La Via Campesina, a global network of peasant organizations and cooperatives with millions of members across the world. So, to the end of his life, his rich, full life, Fred was seeking out ways to make people face what he considered the inconvenient truth of collapse, while upholding the simple dignity of peasant workers as a kind of spiritual and ecological antidote to what ails us. What a way to go indeed. Fred's life yielded many wonderful legacies, not least of which is his children. But we should all be so fortunate to leave behind, as Fred has done with the bioregional group, something that preserves our values as well as our intellect. So as a fellow citizen of the Quinnipiac bioregion that Fred loved so dearly, I salute him for carrying forward the great work of re-inhabiting and re-enchantment with our life places that Thomas Berry speaks of. And I envy Fred for having had so much fun doing that work. And it goes without saying, though I'll say it anyway, that I hope the bioregional group will continue to thrive in a way that would make Fred proud. So thank you for the privilege of sharing these thoughts with you. And I would just, as a postscript, encourage everyone to watch the clip of Fred performing Petroleum Mon Amour. It's only 6 minutes long, and it perfectly showcases Fred's mischievous sense of humor and what he was all about. So thank you again. It will be available later this evening. At the reception? Yes, okay. Thank you.